The grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Welcome to this midweek meditation. This week we are focusing on the spiritual discipline of service. In his book, The Celebration of Discipline, Richard Foster refers to this as the ministry of the towel. Of course, he's referring to Jesus, who on the last night before he would give up his life for us on the cross, gathered his disciples in an upper room, shared with them one last supper, and in all of that imparted more wisdom, really trying to nail home the things that needed to stick. And it was in the midst of all of that stuff going on that Jesus takes off his outer garments, wraps a towel around himself, and with a basin and a pitcher of water, took on the job that was normally reserved for the lowest of servants, cleaning off the feet of the guests. Before all of this, many of the disciples had been arguing about who would be greatest among them. And perhaps it's a natural outflow of this attitude that was pervading some of them that no one had bothered to get the water out. Or maybe it was a pride thing. We can't say for sure. But what we do know is that Jesus humbled himself. That with the water and the towel, he cleaned off all of the grime and grit and caked on dirt and whatever else they might have stepped in the roads of Jerusalem that day. And in all of that, sent them not only a message of love, but set an example. John chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, Jesus says, "So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you." The speculation is that sometimes it's easier for us to follow Jesus' call to leave our father and mother, our homes, and our land for the sake of his gospel than we are to hear his command to wash feet. You see, in the call to leave everything behind, this idea that we talked about last week of radical self-denial, with that kind of comes a sense of adventure. Oftentimes, what accompanies this sense of service is that we must experience many of these little denials or deaths to ourselves. Quite often, service banishes us to the ordinary, the trivial. But what we don't often see in that is if we truly abandon ourselves to this discipline of service, that it enables us to not have to play all of the world's games of promotion and authority and power struggles and politics and all that junk that we so normally get wrapped up in. If we truly are about true service and not self-righteous service, we will see God doing amazing things in our lives, and we will find, again, freedom from so much of the junk of the world. And it's important for us to be able to filter through what it is we think service is, or some of the service that we think that God might be calling us to. Because the self-righteous service is the stuff it's the big stuff that we want to make sure people see us doing. That stuff where when we get the really awful theology in our heads of the giant celestial scoreboard, right, where God's keeping track, and we want to make sure we have more ticks on the good side than the bad. Again, hear me say that is very bad, unbiblical theology. But it is a mindset of many, and so sometimes that self-righteous service is an attempt to put more on the good side of the ledger. True service is the one that doesn't care if anyone notices, and actually quite often seeks out the service where no one will see it being done. Because the reward is not in the applause that might come from the audience, but the reward is in doing what we know God has called us to do, doing what we know is right, and knowing that in some way we are serving and answering God's call to be servant to all. One of the things that came up from this that's still really interesting to me is that self-righteous service is highly concerned with results. And church, we see this a lot in how we serve in our ministry contexts. Now, do not hear me wrong. It is not necessarily a bad thing for us to be good stewards of the resources that He has allocated us with. It is not a bad thing for us to reflect upon our ministries and our services to see if those efforts are meeting needs. But there comes a point where it too often centers on a numbers game, and we turn our churches into businesses, and we sometimes lose the focus of what it is that God is calling us to. So that's something we have to be very, very aware of and very, very careful about, is as we reflect on our service, as we're evaluating that, whose standards are we holding up? Are we engaging in true service or in self-righteous service? Of course, this road to service should lead us to humility. Again, not humility to the point where we get into what Foster and many others dub worm theology, where we think so little of ourselves that we lose sight of the fact that all of humanity bears within it the image of God and is worth redemption and is worth service, because that's what we've been called to. But it's this discipline of service that, when done right, very often fosters growth in this area of humility. And again, we want to make sure that we're getting this in a sense of not a false humility where we say that we don't want to be recognized, but we secretly do, because it's the right thing to say. I don't need your applause. Oh, thank you. You don't need to recognize me. But then there's a small part of us that's like, oh, yes, I'm glad somebody finally noticed. And again, these are part of human emotions. This is part of the struggle. But we want to make sure that we're serving for God to be glorified. We want to make sure that we're serving because that's what God has called us to do, to care for the least and the last and the lost. We want to keep Jesus' Sermon in the Mount in the back of our minds, that even though, he's talking about prayer and fasting and giving of our resources and how we do that, we again want to remember the overall arching theme of that our motivation, that what drives our heart, what drives us to do those things, is really important to the one who judges us and who sees what we do in secret. One of the last few notes about this is that it's really important that we give in not to a sense of choosing to serve, but choosing to be a servant. And that gets wrapped up in being defined by what we do as opposed to being defined by who we are. Because there's a natural human tendency, and again, hear me say this, natural human tendency to be worried about if we're in a life of service completely getting taken advantage of or being walked on or being walked all over. And if we are going to truly be servants, we have to get to the place where we surrender that to God and say, I'm willing to serve wherever you call me, and I am freely giving up that idea of control, of being taken advantage of. Again, I'm not saying anything in terms of not being good stewards of resources or anything like that. Just saying that we want to make sure that we're focused on being servants and not wholly focusing on the act of serving. So there are all different kinds of ways that we can serve. There's this idea, again, that I mentioned of serving in hiddenness. There's the service of the small things. And the way that we tend to overlook that, because when we think of service, we think of the big flashy things, big, mission projects, big ministry things where I can be seen in front of a lot of people. And most of the time what we're called to do is the simple, the mundane, the things that we may not get recognition for this side of heaven, and that's quite all right, because the little things quite often make a deeper impact than the big things that we often celebrate. We want to be in the service of guarding each other's reputations, not engaging in gossip and slander. I know several pastors that who work in larger churches where there's a staff of more than one pastor, who put in place rules basically that say, if you have an issue or a problem or something with a pastor, don't go to another pastor to complain and go behind their back. Go to the pastor that you're having an issue with. Talk directly to them. We as God's children have a duty to do that to one another, to not engage in backbiting and gossiping, but of protecting one another and one another's reputations that way. There's a service of being served. It can be a humbling thing to allow someone to serve you. And again, we go back to that night when Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. Peter said, no, Jesus, you're too good. You can't wash my feet. And Jesus says, you have to let me do this. And then Peter says, okay, well then wash, give me a full bath. Wash me completely. And Jesus says, no, that, for now, it's just this way. And sometimes we have a problem with that. We fear that being served is going to take away from our humility or our desire to serve, and that doesn't have to be the case. So sometimes service is allowing someone to serve you. There's a service of common courtesy, not being afraid of some of the cultural norms in our society. Missionaries tend to be very sensitive to these kind of things, knowing that if you want someone to hear the love and the message that you're wanting to share, you need to affirm the rituals in their culture that are all about acknowledging someone and affirming their value. There's a service of hospitality, the service of listening, service of bearing each other's burdens, and the service of sharing the word of life with one another. There are so many different ways that we can serve, so many ways that God calls us to it. But we are definitely called to, again, what Richard Foster calls the ministry of the towel, to be servant to all, to be least among those around us. And the challenge that he gives is one that I'll extend to you as we wrap up this. in the next couple of days, begin your day praying, asking God, Lord Jesus, if it would please you, bring me someone today whom I can serve. If you're still safe at home, it could be your kids or your spouse. If you're back to work or you're doing other things, it could be someone out in there. And even from a socially distant, safe space, let's see how we can love and serve one another this week. God bless.